In this video, we're going to look at Zcam's S6, a super 35mm sensor-sized cinema camera that currently retails for $2,500. Now, I am not familiar with Zcam and this camera at all, so of course I'm curious, can this camera produce professional quality images, especially, at this price point? And the answer, of course, is yes. This camera can produce outstanding images. Now, I've had a very limited time to spend with this camera, and unfortunately the weather made that time even shorter. We had a hurricane and 3 days without power. But besides the shots that I took with it in this limited time, you could go to Atomos's website or Zcam's website, and you'll see links for material shot by Dan Ludeman and, of course, Philip Bloom. And Ludeman's short, Ellie and Flash in particular, I think the short really shows the potential of this camera when coupled with the Atomos Ninja recording ProRes RAW to produce really outstanding images. And thank you Dan and Phil for those images. The next question, since we know that this camera can produce outstanding images, is how difficult is this to work with? Are there any gotchas we have to know before going into the field? And of course, I'm going to do my first test, which is a very simple, let's turn the camera on in a high heat situation just to see if it can record continuously or if it's going to shut off with overheating issues. So here we are outside, 90-degree day, high humidity, in the beginning of August. I'm just going to let the camera record for at least an hour and see what happens. Now I'm happy to say the camera recorded fine, no glitches, no hiccups. Now I do this test because in the past I haven't caught out on some shoots where we're using the producer's equipment, the camera shuts off for overheating issues or something else. I always want to know, especially when I'm not familiar with the manufacturer, not familiar with the camera, is it going to at least, work on a shoot? So that's why I do this test. I know it's really boring, but this is what I do. Now, it also kind of uncovered the first little idiosyncrasy with this camera, and that is file splitting. Now, file splitting is not new. Cameras have been doing this for a long time, especially since we had the 4 GB limit earlier. This camera determines file splitting by time, not by file size, and it does go between 1 minute and 60 minutes in length. Now, this is user settable, but it is also a requirement. There's no option to not use file splitting. So what's idiosyncratic about this camera is actually how you handle the files in post. So let's go to post and take a look and see what happens. Here in the timeline, I have 2 files that have been split, and I simply, butt them together in a timeline. And if we look down here in the audio section, we can see that, the last frame, the last half frame, the audio simply drops out. I do want to mention in my test, the video stays in sync. It does not add or drop frames. It just seems that the audio drops out. Now, there are at least 3 obvious workarounds to the dropped audio problem. And the first one is a free utility provided by Zcam called the Concatenator, and that's a free download from the website. And with this utility, it will take the string of files and it will combine them into a single file. It will rewrite a new file, and it will fix the dropped audio problem. You'll no longer have these audio glitch. The second obvious solution is the one that I would use, and that is to use double system sound. Now, with this review, I just didn't have enough time to get into the audio on this camera, but my past experience, my previous experience with basically every other camera, is that the audio is not nearly as good as the Sound Devices MixPre 6 that I'm using currently. So I'm personally always going to use double system sound, either with my own recorder on extremely low budget jobs, or I'm just simply going to hire an audio professional. Now, the third fix for this is to use the HDMI port in the camera and record externally to a Ninja 5. Like we have over here. If you record to the Ninja 5, you will not have broken files. And as this camera really needs a monitor, it's going to be a solution that's going to be readily available, at least for me. The split file issue leads us into the next gotcha, which actually is not unique to Zcam at all. And that is, if you're recording and you happen to lose power while you're recording, if your battery came out or if it, just ran out of juice, the file will be corrupted. You'll lose the file. Now, Zcam did not provide a utility, a file recovery utility. At least I did not find it on their website. I did not find it in the documentation. So that leads me to believe that it's going to be difficult to recover that file. And again, this is not unique to Zcam. It's something that we've had to deal with ever since we've had digital media. And to me, the obvious workaround is to use external power. For example, we could use block batteries, we could use AC adapters, we could use other, NP batteries on different sleds. And when we power the camera with an external power supply and the block battery, if we were to lose power to from either source, the camera will still operate and will continue to record. And then at this point, we could close out the file. We could, just hit record, close out the file, and we're all good. So, for example, as you can see here, the camera is on. If I lose battery power, the camera remains on. Now I just hit the menu button, but you get the point. So this is going to be my solution if I were to use this camera. Just have two power sources, which is something that we do anyway. And I probably wouldn't use such a big battery. I'll use a smaller NP battery, and this becomes the backup battery. And it also becomes like the hot swap battery and everything else. So there are regular production workarounds that we use to get around this issue of corrupted files. Now, before we get into the next test, I do want to just talk about the layout and ergonomics of this camera briefly. Now, as you can see, this is a true cinema style camera. It's basically a box with a sensor, a lens mount, and battery and input-output. So very straightforward, very simple, and also very compact, as you can see. Now, a couple of things that stick out to me that I really like about this camera, especially at this price point. It starts with the lens mount. This has a locking style EF mount. In other words, you twist the lens mount, the lens comes on and off. To put it back on, you simply twist it back on, and you know that the lens is securely locked in place. Now, this is the style of mount that we use, of course, in cinema cameras with the PL mounts, the LPL, the BNCR have this mount, and it's just it's a strong mount. It's much stronger than the still style twist-on mount. And when you're working with larger, heavier cinema lenses and matte boxes and rods and lens supports and everything, it's just a much more efficient way to work. Again, this is what we're used to. The fact that Zcam has it on here, it's just a great addition. Now, to put things in perspective, my previous camera, the C300 Mark II, that just had a regular twist-on EF lens mount. And Canon did come up with an option to come up with a locking ring style mount, and they wanted $2,000 just for the lens mount. I actually considered buying it because, when you're using not so much this lens, but typically we'll use a 17-120 Canon lens, and that is much larger, much heavier than this lens. And of course, we may be using a matte box and accessories like a wireless follow focus, and it's just much easier and faster to be able to take your lens, to twist it off, of course that was PL, and insert your lens and put it back on. It's just a more efficient way to work when your camera is on a tripod. Now with me, camera's almost always going to be on a tripod, or it's going to be in some type of rig that we could just put down, and I could use hands to change the lens. Now if you're coming from stills or hybrid cameras, mirrorless cameras, and you don't use a tripod, maybe you're always hand holding it, then yeah, I could kind of see how maybe you don't really appreciate or really don't like this lens mount, because you have your camera here, you would have your camera here, and you just want to take your one hand to unlock it, twist off the lens, put it on, put another lens on. That's your workflow. That's the way you're working. And yes, then the traditional still style lens mount would probably work better. But for us guys, who are used to just working off tripods, this is definitely a bonus. Now, the other thing I like about this camera, of course, is the battery power. This takes your standard Sony NP style battery. These have been around for years, and so many people make these batteries. It's kind of like a generic battery now, and it's great because this battery will power this camera for hours. You can have a couple or maybe 3 or 4 of these batteries, and you're good for the day with this camera. Now, it does have, besides the NP battery mount, it looks like a 2-pin LEMO 12-volt in and a 12-volt out for accessories. Again, this camera looks like it's using LEMO connectors, which is great because that's a professional style locking connector. With media, let's go into media. This camera has one media slot. It's right here. Right now I have a CF card in here. CF card. Now, the CF cards they've been around for quite a while. I know a number of people complain about the cost of them. The only thing I have to say a couple things about CF cards. One is I've been using CF cards for maybe what, 4 or 5 years. I have not had a single problem yet with a CF card. Now, electronics, eventually it'll fail, just a matter of when. But so far, CF cards have been very reliable for me. In terms of cost, they're not the cheapest cards. For example, the SD cards, or new fast SD cards, they're much cheaper than CF cards. Of course, we have the new, CF Fast, CF Express card. So it seems to never end. But it's reliable and relatively high capacity. Now, if you remember a long time ago when we had P2 cards, and of course the Red Mags and Red Mini Mags, those cards cost about $2,000 a piece. So if you're going to complain about the cost of a CF card, the only thing I can tell you is that it's actually gotten much cheaper over the years, and it continues to get cheaper. So again, this is older technology. It hasn't quite come down in price as much as we want, but I've had good reliability with it. So again, I'm satisfied having CF cards. I also happen to own a handful of them, so that makes it easier for me. Okay. Now you can also record through a USB-C port here. You can use your standard Samsung T5 or other manufacturers' hard drive, SSD, but apparently you cannot record to the SSD and to the CFast card at the same time. Now, I personally, if that was the limitation, I know these are much cheaper. I would never record to this as my sole recording device, simply because the possibility of a kick out over here, it's just too great. If you have a kick out, you lose the file. You lose the file. It's a disaster in the making. If we have to choose between this or the CFast card, I would always choose internally. Now, another option we have for recording is, of course, the HDMI port. If we're going to use something like this, the Atomos Ninja 5 to record off of. And of course, just HDMI to here. Now, if you do record to the Atomos through the HDMI port, you can, of course, record internally at the same time to the CFast card, or through the USB-C port, to an SSD. In that situation, if I'm recording here, then you know what? I would actually use the USB-C port, because this becomes my backup. This is my backup recording going to a device like this. Perfectly fine, because my main recording is actually going to be here on the Ninja. So that's when I would definitely use something like this, because it is, again, much more frugal than getting a bunch of CF cards. So that's it for recording media. The next gotcha I want to talk about is field of view. Now let's set up the camera for 4K Ultra HD, and here are some of the various field of views you get depending on the options you choose in camera. Now, the change in field of view is not unique to Zcam, but it is something that you need to be familiar with, and you need to be familiar with the menus and the options. Otherwise, when you get on set, it's not what you expect. You have to quickly figure out, what went wrong, or how is the camera set. Now, here's an example of the different resolutions and the field of views with those resolutions. As you can see, we just have a lot of combinations available with this camera, which in general is a very good thing, but it's something that you just have to stay on top of. Let's take a quick look at rolling shutter. Now, the example here is purely anecdotal. It's not scientific in any way. And my feeling is the rolling shutter on the S6 is very average, kind of just very typical of what we have with CMOS cameras. Zcam does offer a mode, Low Jello. It works under a slight crop, and it does seem to reduce the rolling shutter effect. Now, for the next test, I'm going to test the apparent sharpness at different resolutions. And to do this, I dug up my ancient Putora lens sharpness chart. Now, this is a couple decades old. This is what we used to measure sharpness on film lenses. Now, for this test, again, I'm just curious about the apparent sharpness at different resolutions. For example, is 4K softer than 6K? I kind of already know HD is softer, but this will give a real good idea of how much sharper or softer one resolution is than the other. And again, I'm just sticking with 6K, 4K, and HD resolutions, because those are the most common resolutions I'll be working with. When we punch in, I really don't see much difference between the 6K and 4K on the edit system, and to be honest, the HD looks sharper than expected. What I'm going to conclude with this test is that the advantage of 6K is primarily a wider field of view. We're set up now for a very quick low light test. Now the Zcam S6, it is a dual native ISO camera, both at ISO 400 and at 1250. But I'm going to run it up to maximum ISO, and really we're going to check and see, is there a color shift at different ISO levels with a color chip chart, and of course the amount of noise and what type of noise pattern we get on the black duvetine. So let's take a look at that now. Now, this was recorded in Rec 709, and the only adjustments I made in Premiere were to the exposure values in Lumetri. And, it's not perfect, but, because, Lumetri, it's a rather crude, it's like by 0.1, but this is the result of it. Now, of course, above 5000 ISO, the blacks just get crushed, not to be expected. But I was actually surprised how well the colors more or less stay together, until above 10,000, 20,000 in this test. And here's a progression of that test. Now with this test, I've set the camera to ISO 400 and I'm underexposing by a stop using the shutter, and then bringing up the levels again in Lumetri to match the white levels. And as expected, the blacks, as we get higher in the underexposure, the blacks simply get crushed. And here's a progression of this test. This is a quick look at some high-speed work. Now for comparison, I shot this at 23.98. And now we are at 75 frames per second. And as you can see, there was I wasn't expecting this this crop in, but also the color shift. There's definitely a color shift at 75 frames per second. With the Zcams, you definitely want to use a monitor, and the two monitors of choice seem to be either the Ninja 5 by Atomos or the BM5 by Portkeys. And the reason is, both monitors, they are able to communicate directly with the camera if you have the right cable, and you'll gain touchscreen control. And apparently, people report back that it really adds a lot of functional use to the cameras to be able to, just have touchscreen control. I don't have the cable. It's been, back ordered or out of stock at B&H, so I have not been able to test that. The camera, as it sits, is capable of recording RAW, both internally, Z-RAW internal, and of course Apple's ProRes RAW through the Ninja Recorder. All the firmware is now up to date. I did not test this, and I didn't test this for a couple of reasons. The main reason is I simply ran out of time. I mean, again, I have to return this today. I'm just out of time. The other reason, too, is that in the past 7 years, I would say, I have not had a single client who has requested RAW. In fact, everyone has turned it down whenever I bring it up. The main request, of course, is for ProRes. Many people want to work in certain log color spaces like S-Log3, S-Log, or C-Log, C-Log2. They do not want RAW, okay? And again, as a working stiff, my clients simply do not want it. Even the independent features, they just say, no, we can't afford it. So, so that's another reason why I'm just skipping over it, because, again, it's not a request, and I'm just out of time. All right, it's time to wrap up this review because I literally have to wrap up this camera and send it back. Now, Zcam has given us a very, very interesting cinema-style camera, Super 35 format, for $2,500. Now, to me, this is really interesting because, as a full-time freelance director of photography, virtually all of my shoots are multi-camera shoots, between 2 to 4 cameras typically, and that's for all genres. It's for independent features, it's for episodic TV, it's for, broadcast TV, it's for small commercials, and of course, corporate work. Everything seems to be multi-camera shoots right now. And, typically on the bigger projects, we of course just rent what we need, but, on pretty much all the other projects, we're scrambling to put together an equipment package that works, and invariably we're mixing and matching, cameras and lenses. So at $2,500, I think it is conceivable for an owner-operator to own, 2 or 3 bodies, so you always have a multi-camera package ready and available to go at a variety of price points. And again, this camera can work on a variety of different projects. It's not limited to low budget projects only. Now, does that mean that I'm going to run out and buy a couple of bodies? Probably not this month, and that's only because of the competition about cameras that are about to be released. I do want to test them and see how well they can be, incorporated into a regular production work environment. Now, obviously, we use everything, so again, I'm just waiting to see what's available. But if you do need to get a camera now, or if this camera fits your needs, I do think, again, if you spend time to learn to get the best image out of the camera, if you rig it out a little bit, because I would rig it out, it's a completely viable and completely usable camera for your productions. So wish you the best, and we'll see you on the next one.